Muted. Teach Me How to Talk by Apple Cider 15. Read by My Lost and Found. Summary. He heard his name being called. Shinsou. He turned around and felt his blood run cold when he saw Aizawa walking towards him. Shinsou's nerves had already been on edge, but now they were working overtime. He stumbled backwards slightly. "What are you doing out here so late?" Aizawa asked him, his face blank as usual. Shinsou scrambled for something, anything, pulling up the scarf self-consciously. He couldn't imagine what would happen if Aizawa saw the muzzle. Would he finally decide that Shinsou was a lost cause? If Shinsou couldn't even stand up to the Kitoshas, how could he ever become a hero? In which Shinsou is in need of a hug, and he gets one. Aizawa and Hizashi are in need of a child, and they get one. And I am in need of several hours of lost sleep. By the time Shinsou got back, it was nearly dark. The street lamps glowed softly on the sidewalk, and his legs felt like lead from sparring with Aizawa. When Aizawa had approached him a few months ago and proposed private training lessons with the possibility of maybe someday transferring to the hero course, he had been in shock. It was more than anything he could ever wish for. Aizawa was an interesting teacher, to say the least. But Shinsou wasn't going to let that or anything squander this one chance at becoming a hero, as he had always wished. Even if it was only to prove everyone who hadn't believed in him wrong. Now, though, he wanted to prove that Aizawa was right. Shinsou did have what it took to become a hero. He already arrived early to lessons, went on a run every morning, stuck to the workout routine Aizawa had given him. Even though he didn't exactly follow the meal plan Aizawa had given him, there wasn't really a lot he could do about that. His foster parents were lenient in it and didn't keep food from him too much, but they also didn't hand out full meals 3 times a day. It was exhausting, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Every time Aizawa spoke to him, Shinsou's mind conjured twisted nightmares of Aizawa walking away, telling him it was pointless. Shinsou didn't have what it took. He could never become a hero. But Aizawa hadn't yet. In fact, last week when Shinsou had turned up 10 minutes late to practice, Aizawa had given Shinsou his number. Something about emergencies or some shit. Shinsou hadn't really been listening, too busy typing the new contact onto his cracked phone. It was a struggle, walking uphill, and he was almost thankful to finally reach the house. Almost. The house was quiet when he walked inside, eerily so. He peered into the kitchen, but it was empty, as was the living room and bedroom. He was alone. Feeling some tension leave his shoulders, he went back to his bedroom and pushed his backpack under the bed quietly. Though there was no one home to hear it, he still felt uneasy. He changed out of his workout clothes and took a quick shower. When he was finished, he could hear someone pottering around the kitchen. The clink of cutlery and glasses. His stomach rumbled, and he waited a few minutes to see whether Mr./Mrs. Kinoshita would leave, but to no result. Eventually, he reasoned that he could just sneak some pot noodles or something quick. There wouldn't be any trouble. Miss Kinoshita was there in the kitchen. Shinsou considered going back to his room when he saw the bottle of alcohol in her hand, but she had already seen him. He kept his head down and brooded around an empty cupboard, his hands shaking slightly. "Where have you been, brat?" she asked him, voice slurred. "I was at UA training." "Why?" he replied instinctively, and winced when she whacked him around the head. "No questions!" He huffed and paused his rummaging, opening his mouth to talk, but then decided against it, mentally berating himself. If Midoriya had been in his position, he wouldn't have kept quiet. He would have stood up for himself. Shinsou's mouth ticked up with the thought of the green-haired imp. Where's your muzzle? Miss Kinoshita asked. Shinsou sucked in a breath. His brain went blank for a moment. In my room. He knocked over a cup by accident. It rolled slowly on the countertop. Well? She pushed him to the door. Go get it. You know the rules, Shinsou. We don't ask for a lot. Yes, Miss Kinoshita. He nodded, respectfully, and went to his bedroom. The muzzle was hidden in his backpack, down at the bottom. He swallowed as he picked up the straps. His mouth tasted bitter as he saw the blood stains. He strapped it on as gently as he could, but the metal still bit into his skin, making his eyes water. He blinked quickly, brushing tears from his eyes. He couldn't cry now, even though he had done this more times than he could count. It still didn't make it easier. His head felt foggy, but he went back to the kitchen. Hopefully, he would be allowed to eat something, although he didn't feel very hungry anymore. Miss Kinoshita was still in the kitchen when she saw him give a queasy smile. That's it, Shinsou. Good job. He hated that it made him feel better. He grasped the pot of noodles he had rooted out earlier and held them up questioningly. Miss Kinoshita smiled and patted him on the head, making him flinch. She shook her head. No food. Be a good boy and get me some chocolates from the store. It's Bereshit and mine's anniversary today, and we're going to celebrate tonight. She smiled again. He didn't question it, just nodded and dodged away from another demeaning pat. Before leaving, he wrapped a blue striped scarf around his face. The muzzle was derogatory and insulting enough without anyone else seeing it. His shoes, tattered and all, slipped on easy enough, and the door was banged shut behind him. The nearest shop was only a few minutes away. He had picked out the cheapest chocolates there out of spite. He paid for them and left. But when he got back and unlocked the door to the house, it wouldn't open. He pushed it harder, wondering whether it had gotten stuck on a shoe or something. It didn't open. With dreading realization, he realized that Miss Kinoshita had locked it from the other side. Shinsou had been locked out of the house before. His former foster parents had refused to give him keys to the house, and spent so little time at home that 3 times out of 4, no one answered the door. It hadn't happened with the Kinoshitas before, but he supposed it was only a matter of time. He sighed, resigning himself to another night curled up on a cold bench. He walked back the way he had come, slowly this time. It was properly dark now. Houses were lit up, warm and bright. The co-op that he had visited earlier was warmer than it was outside, so he browsed slowly through it, dumping the chocolates in the bin because they were no use to him. He could hardly eat them. He couldn't eat anything until the damned muscle came off, which wouldn't be until tomorrow, it seemed. Only Mr. and Mrs. Kinoshita could take it off. It had some tricky mechanism at the back, meaning that he could only put it on, not take it off. He wandered through another few shops, warming his hands and suddenly thankful for the scarf. It was only when he was looking through some sort of shop that sold spices and herbs and that sort of thing, when he heard his name being called. Shinsou! He turned around and felt his blood run cold when he saw Aizawa walking towards him. Shinsou's nerves had already been on edge, but now they were working overtime. He stumbled back slightly. What are you doing out so late? Aizawa asked him, his face blank as usual. Shinsou scrambled for something, anything, pulling up the scarf self-consciously. He couldn't imagine what would happen if Aizawa saw the muzzle. Would he finally decide that Shinsou was a lost cause? If Shinsou couldn't even stand up to the Kinoshitas, how could he ever become a hero? His breath came short, and he struggled to stay present, the muzzle biting into his mouth. It was searing into his brain. He couldn't think of anything but the way his mouth tasted of blood. So, he heard a noise and snapped back to Aizawa standing in front of him, looking concerned. He tried, but it only came out as a weak, muffled noise. Shinsou, are you okay? Aizawa tried again, raising a hand. Shinsou stepped away, jerking back. He shook his head, trying to clear it. Hey, take a deep breath. He needed to get away. His throat grew tight and his vision blurred, narrowing in on Aizawa in front of him. Shinsou needed to leave. He couldn't make out what Aizawa was saying, but it didn't matter. He turned and ran. His breaths came out in white plumes outside. It was cold. When his hands shook, he wasn't sure whether or not it was from the cold either. Everything seemed blurry and ethereal, as if he was a ghost watching his body run out of the shop. It sickened him. The muzzle was only a distant nightmare, but if he thought really hard, he could still feel the lines pressing into his face and blood welling in his mouth. But that didn't matter. He stopped a few paces from the shop, his legs still aching from sparring with Aizawa. Dizzy, he slumped against a wall, trying to breathe, but his lungs wouldn't move the way he wanted them to, too frozen with blinding fear. Something was moving in front of him, but he couldn't grasp onto any one thing. Noise dissolved into something static and indiscernible. The only thing he could make out was his name. Someone was saying his name. Shinsou. He didn't understand anything, but suddenly the muzzle was back, and iron filled his mouth. Aizawa stood in front of him. Breathe, Shinsou, he was saying. Shinsou tried to speak, but only a muffled mew came out. Breathe. Deep breaths, Shinsou. He only managed a few staggered breaths, but some butchery of clarity returned. It took a few minutes until he had calmed enough to understand that he was standing on the sidewalk with Aizawa, who looked worried. He didn't say anything. The silence stretched. Are you okay now? Aizawa asked. Shinsou nodded stiffly. Can you talk? Shinsou hesitated, wincing with blood in his mouth before shaking his head. Aizawa sighed, stepping back slightly, giving Shinsou more space. Okay, all right. He examined the shaky boy before him wearily. Are you cold? Shinsou wasn't sure. He just felt numb. He shrugged. Here. Aizawa pulled off his gloves and passed them over. Shinsou tried to shake his head, but Aizawa pressed the gloves onto his numb fingers, pulling them on gently. His hands were warm, but firm. Then he stood back. There was another slow silence, and it passed hazily for Shinsou. The cotton gloves are thick and soft on his hands. Such a contrast to the muzzle. It was all he could focus on. Do you want to come back to my house? Shinsou froze and shrugged awkwardly. He pulled out the gloves, rubbing the material between his fingers. All right. Aizawa clicked his tongue. Come on. He beckoned to Shinsou. I need to get some groceries, but we'll be quick. Shinsou followed Aizawa back around the shop like a lost duckling, still feeling slightly intangible. As Aizawa had said, the trip was quick, and soon enough, Aizawa was guiding Shinsou to the passenger seat. The car was soft and warm. The engine rumbled soothingly, and the radio that Aizawa had turned on at some point was not too loud, just enough to keep Shinsou tethered to reality. The meltdown, or whatever had happened, appeared to have drained Shinsou of any remaining energy. Now that the adrenaline had worn off, he felt his eyes drooping. By the time the car slid to a stop, he had slumped against the car window. His breath fogged the glass. He followed Aizawa out of the car diligently, and held out a hand, offering to carry one of the shopping bags. Instead, Aizawa transferred the shopping bags both onto one hand and grasped Shinsou's hand in his. Shinsou was too tired to complain. The walk to the apartment was quick but cold, jarring him awake. When they reached the apartment door, Aizawa dropped Shinsou's hand to unlock it. Shinsou had never thought much about what Aizawa's apartment would be like, but if he had guessed, he never would have guessed this. The first thing he noticed was that it was warm. The second was that a cat was sitting on a soft red couch. There were pictures and books everywhere, and several pairs of shoes piled haphazardly by the door. A yellow sleeping bag lay on the couch next to the cat, and he could hear the clanging of pots coming from the kitchen. "Honey!" A shout came from some other room. Aizawa gestured to the red couch as he slipped off his shoes. "Sit down. Make yourself comfortable, Shinsou. I'll be back in a minute." While Aizawa was gone, Shinsou slipped off his shoes and hesitantly perched on the couch beside the cat. It was sleeping, but peeled one eye open when he sat down. Shinsou slipped off the black gloves Aizawa had lent him and hesitantly pet the cat. It only yawned softly, unimpressed. Aizawa came back a few minutes later, another man following behind him. With his long blonde hair loose and the fluffy jumper and sweatpants, it took Shinsou a few moments to realize that the man standing behind Aizawa was Present Mike. Present Mike smiled softly and held out a hand. "Nice to finally meet you, Shinsou." Shinsou shook his hand, hoping that they missed the way his fingers were trembling. "Are you hungry, Shinsou?" Aizawa asked. "You should probably eat something." Shinsou nodded, but then froze and shook his head. How stupid. He couldn't eat anything until the muzzle came off. Aizawa frowned. "Come, Hizashi made soup." Shinsou followed them to the kitchen, where Present Mike pulled out a chair for him and placed a bowl of delicious-smelling soup in front of him. "Here!" Aizawa sat beside him, and Present Mike across from him as they ate, but Shinsou made no move to pick up the spoon. "You can eat, Shinsou," Aizawa directed him. Shinsou shook his head. His stomach felt like it was being eaten from the inside out. He kept his gaze down on his lap. He didn't know what he was supposed to do here. Everything about this place was unfamiliar. "Why can't you eat, Shinsou?" Aizawa asked him. Shinsou didn't reply. Aizawa stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor, and Shinsou flinched so hard he almost fell out of his chair. He didn't look up. A few seconds later, a piece of paper and a pen was pushed in front of him. "If you're still not talking, use this." "I'm not hungry," he wrote. With impeccable timing, his stomach rumbled. There was silence. "All right. Would you prefer to sleep instead? We have a spare bedroom you can use." He hesitated and then nodded. "Okay, come on." He followed Aizawa out of the kitchen. "You can hang your scarf by the door." Shinsou's breath caught, and Aizawa stopped in front of him and leaned down so they were face to face. "You know you can tell me anything, Shinsou. I'm here to help you." Shinsou nodded. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Shinsou hesitated but shook his head. Bar his bloody mouth and jaw sore from the tight straps of the muzzle, he was fine. "Do I need to call your guardians?" Shinsou shook his head again. "Are you going to take off your scarf? You're not still cold, are you?" Shinsou didn't move. Aizawa sighed and straightened up again. "Come on, kid." The bedroom was bigger than the one at the Kishinada's, with pretty blue walls and a neat, clean bed done up with a colorful quilt. "I'll leave you to it, Shinsou. Come and get me if you need anything. All right?" The door shut softly behind Aizawa. The bed was soft, and Shinsou bundled himself carefully underneath the covers. The muzzle hurt. His face was probably badly bruised. He didn't usually wear it for this long. It hurt whenever he moved, and his mouth tasted sour and metallic. It was super gross, but luckily he was really tired, so he fell asleep quickly enough. Shinsou woke up later than usual, surprised that he had slept through the night. It was probably about midday. He winced as he sat up, his jaw burning and his mouth stiff and vile tasting. He wasn't sure if he was allowed out of the bedroom or what the rules were in this house, but he figured that he probably wouldn't get in trouble for breaking a rule that he didn't know existed. Aizawa and Present Mike didn't seem like those kind of people. The house was quiet. The living room was empty, apart from another cat sleeping on the couch, a different one than before. Aizawa and Present Mike were both sitting in the kitchen, drinking cups of coffee, and when Shinsou walked in, they looked up. "Morning, little listener," Present Mike said, a wonky smile on his face. He looked at Shinsou strangely. Aizawa frowned. Did Shinsou do something wrong? "What's on your face, Shinsou?" Aizawa asked. Shinsou's blood ran cold. He'd forgotten about the scarf covering the muzzle. It must have jostled while he was sleeping. Immediately, he brought his hands up to fix it again, pulling it over his nose. But it was too late. Aizawa stood up and walked over, his face stony and cold. "Shinsou, take off the scarf." Shinsou jerked back, still holding the scarf, and shook his head. Present Mike stood up as well and pressed a hand to Aizawa's shoulder. "We're not going to hurt you, Shinsou. We just want to help." He gave a small smile. "Will you let us help you?" Shinsou didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure what was meant to happen now. Should he move the scarf? Then Aizawa would find out. He wouldn't train Shinsou anymore. Shinsou would never get into the hero course. But Shinsou didn't really have any other choice. With shaking hands, he pulled the scarf and handed it over to Aizawa. He stood there, waiting for something to happen. But for a while, nothing did. Aizawa's face turned cold and angry. "Is that?" His voice was horrified. Present Mike looked sad. Finally, Present Mike spoke softly. "Can you take it off by yourself?" Shinsou shook his head and looked down at his feet. "Will you let me take it off for you?" Aizawa offered, his expression now schooled into something more appropriate. Shinsou tensed, but he really wanted it gone, so he nodded stiffly. "Okay, I'll be as gentle as I can." Aizawa stepped closer, and Shinsou turned the back of his head towards him. Firm hands brushed through his hair, looking for the straps, and after several moments, something clicked and the pressure on his jaw and mouth released. He couldn't help a whimper that escaped his mouth as dried blood cracked, sores opened, and his skin was pulled. Water blurred his eyes as the muzzle was placed down on the table. "Oh, Shinsou," a soft voice cooed. He peered up at Aizawa and Present Mike, who stepped away. "I'll go get a washcloth and some cream for your bruises." Aizawa stayed behind him and brushed away a tear from his cheek. "We've got you, Shinsou," he said, and Shinsou burst into tears. Aizawa stepped close to him and pulled Shinsou into a tight hug. Shinsou's face hurt, and he knew he was getting Aizawa's jumpy all wet, and with the tasting of metal in his mouth, probably bloody. But it didn't really matter when Aizawa's arms were wrapped tight around him, and a hand was stroking through his hair, rubbing circles onto his back. "I've got you, Shinsou," Aizawa muttered, and bundled Shinsou up in his arms. He brought Shinsou over to the couch. It was much more comfortable than just standing in the middle of the kitchen, and had held Shinsou tight against his chest, and Shinsou sobbed. Shinsou wasn't sure when Present Mike came back, but when the sobbing had eased slightly, though salty tears were still making his way down bruised cheeks, he looked up from Aizawa's arms. Present Mike was sitting beside them, with an arm curled around Aizawa. Shinsou wasn't sure whether it looked like Present Mike was crying, or if it was just his own blurry vision. Present Mike passed him a glass of water. "You probably want to rinse your mouth." Shinsou sat up and took it gladly and drank the whole thing. It didn't really get rid of the icky taste in his mouth, but his mouth and throat didn't feel so dry anymore. Aizawa's hand brushed through his hair. It felt so different from when Mrs. Kinoshita would ruffle his hair or send him off to the shop with a rough pat on his back. It brought more tears to his eyes, and Shinsou began to wonder whether he would ever stop crying. He lay back down, clutching Aizawa's jumper in his hands, scared that he might pull away. "Shinsou," Aizawa said gently, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Is it all right if Hizashi cleans your face?" It took a moment to realize what Aizawa meant, but Shinsou quickly figured that he had been bleeding several times throughout yesterday, and he had worn the muzzle for a long time. It wasn't too far to imagine that there's probably blood and cuts all over his face. He nodded and sat up, reluctant to ease himself from Aizawa, but he did nonetheless. Present Mike was gentle as he took a wet cloth to Shinsou's face. He cupped Shinsou's cheek, thumbs set firmly on his chin to keep Shinsou's head still as he washed the blood. His hands were soft, and although sometimes he pushed down slightly too hard on the bruises and pulled at a cut, it was over quickly, and Shinsou sunk back down into Aizawa's arms. Shinsou could hear Present Mike moving around, but he kept his eyes closed and zoned out, only paying attention to the hand in his hair. Eventually, he drifted off, not really asleep, but also not really present either. He wasn't really aware of anything, but at one point he could hear Aizawa and Present Mike talking in hushed voices. He didn't catch any of the words or what they were saying. He stayed dozing, not really wanting to wake up because then he would have to move. Another time before he became aware, there was a warm, callous hand on his cheek, and he didn't have the energy to do anything but lean into the contact. When he finally woke up, because his stomach was complaining too much for it to be comfortable anymore, he yawned and opened his eyes. "Finally awake, Shinsou?" Present Mike smiled. Shinsou looked over at him. "How?" He coughed, his throat dry and sore. "How long was I asleep for?" "About 4 hours. You're probably hungry, right? How would you feel about something to eat now?" Shinsou ducked his head and nodded. "Please, thank you." Present Mike went to get something to eat. Shinsou quickly figured that Aizawa was fast asleep, head slumped against a pillow and mouth slightly ajar. Present Mike came back with a bowl and a spoon. "Thank you, Present Mike." "Call me Hizashi, little listener." Shinsou finished the bowl quickly. It was delicious and warm, the bowl heating up his hands. Suddenly, Aizawa groaned and sat up. "Shinsou? Hizashi?" His voice was muffled with sleep. Present Mike, Hizashi, smiled affectionately. "Shinsou's awake." Aizawa rubbed a circle on Shinsou's shoulder, and he struggled not to lean into the touch. "How are you feeling?" "Good. Better. Thank you." Shinsou replied woodenly. "That's good." Present Mike hummed. "Shinsou, there's no pressure to talk if you don't want to. But We do need to at some point, Aizawa pointed out. Shinsou stiffened. Well, what do you want to know? Aizawa pulled Shinsou closer to him, feeling the boy grow tense and stroking his hair. Shinsou relaxed, breathing out shakily. How about we start with where that muzzle came from? Shinsou nodded. Okay. He could do this. Clutching Aizawa's jumper in his hand, he took a deep breath and began.